sleep with history. What beauty standards were like in medieval times and more. Close your eyes, just for a second, and imagine a world not guided by the glow of screens or the hum of city lights, but by candlelight and the soft rustle of brocade gowns brushing stone floors. Inhale deeply and let your thoughts drift to another time, a place suspended between superstition and spectacle, where beauty was not about vitality or health, but about ethereal fragility, a deliberate dance with death's aesthetic. Tonight, as you settle into your quiet corner of the world, whether you're wrapped in a blanket or listening under moonlight, allow the hush of history to pull you in. Let the air still around you and feel yourself drawn into a time where ideals of allure were not warm and sun-kissed, but ghostly and distant, as though beauty itself had been summoned from a dream just out of reach. In the medieval imagination, the body was a canvas not of expression, but of erasure, of warmth, of labor, of reality itself. Pale skin wasn't merely a preference, it was a proclamation. It told the world that you did not toil under the sun, that you were untouched by the crude marks of work or weather. The paler you were, the more removed from the earthly you appeared, and the closer you came to a kind of social ascension. This obsession with pallor birthed practices that today would seem chilling. To achieve the prized complexion, one that hinted at noble blood, spiritual purity, or perhaps the faint suggestion of never having lived at all, noble women and men turned to powders made with white lead. This wasn't makeup as we understand it now. It was transformation, a mask that suggested otherworldliness. And yes, it was lethal. But slow death by vanity was a price the elite were willing to pay for that almost spectral elegance. Complementing the porcelain skin, features were sculpted to defy nature further. Eyebrows, plucked into oblivion or removed entirely to make the forehead appear vast and contemplative. Hairlines were sometimes shaved back to elongate the face, enhancing the aura of serene detachment. Even the lips and cheeks, which might betray health with their warmth, were subdued with powders and tinctures to preserve the illusion of stillness. These rituals, passed from court to court, were not just beauty routines. They were performances of class, power, and divine favor. As we slip further into this forgotten mirror, let us remember, in the medieval world, beauty whispered of stillness, silence, and suffering. A strange, haunted elegance that shimmered just beyond the veil of life. 1. The alchemy of elegance, when beauty was measured in moonlight and poison. Let your breathing slow and your senses soften as we step into a time wrapped in candle smoke and whispered prayers, where beauty was not something radiant and alive, but something cold, calculated, and otherworldly. Imagine walking through a stone corridor, echoing with soft footfalls and the rustle of velvet. This is not the world of the living as we know it, but a realm where appearance was an art of illusion and artifice. Here, pale was not pale. It was luminescence, a glow that seemed spun from moonlight and mist, an absence of vitality that signified wealth, virtue, and the sacred privilege of never lifting a finger beneath the sun. In this aesthetic doctrine of the Middle Ages, to look strong or ruddy was to look common, and thus the elite sought instead the soft translucence of skin that had never known labor. But the body is stubborn. It blushes, it freckles, it tans with every whisper of light, and so it had to be coerced, subdued, reshaped through acts of devotion that blurred the line between ritual and ruin. Vinegar-soaked cloths were pressed to the skin in hopes of coaxing out a fainter hue. Others turned to a strange alchemy of crushed pearls and egg whites, crafting a paste that whitened the complexion while leaving the cheeks with the taut, bizarre texture of an overcooked breakfast. Yet this discomfort was a small price to pay for the illusion of delicate refinement. And refinement, after all, was the highest currency of nobility. But paleness alone was not enough. Veins were painted in fine, trembling blue lines across the chest and arms to mimic the fragile, almost translucent skin of those whose blood pulsed quietly beneath a paper-thin barrier. This wasn't just a cosmetic preference. It was a constructed language of status, a statement that your body was untouched, unused, and unfit for the fields. Romantic poets, never ones to miss a metaphor, fed into this fantasy with verses praising women as white as snow, as pale as milk, or as wan as the winter moon. A celestial way of saying she looked just on the edge of collapse. And that edge, that aesthetic of near vanishing, became the holy grail of beauty. The tools to reach it were drawn from both farm and laboratory, from hens and hazardous minerals alike. White lead powder became the cornerstone of the noble look. Crafted by soaking strips of lead in vinegar until they corroded into a brittle crust, this powder was then finely ground and applied daily to the face, sometimes layered with chalk dust or mercury-laced rouge for added dimension. Egg whites were brushed across the skin to provide a glossy, shell-like finish, turning the face into a porcelain mask of virtue and artifice. The lead gave wearers the matte, ghostly perfection of a painted icon, but also brought with it fatigue, blistering, hair loss, and eventual systemic failure. Skin peeled, ulcerated, and sometimes wept quietly beneath the glamour. But the illusion it provided was worth the decay it caused. Because in this world, a slow death wrapped in silk was preferable to a healthy life touched by toil. And it didn't stop with women. Male courtiers, too, especially as courts grew more image-conscious in the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, dabbled in these deadly enhancements. Skin treatments, subtle pigments, and scented powders became part of the masculine arsenal, because in the high-stakes theater of nobility, your face was not just your face. It was your pedigree, your power, your politics. Smelling slightly better than your rival might win you a favor. Looking like you'd never broken a sweat might win you a crown. Thus, the pursuit of beauty in the Middle Ages was not a search for vitality, but a performance of vanishing, a slow fading into elegance so profound it threatened to erase you entirely. 2. The vanishing brow, a medieval obsession with a divine forehead. Let your thoughts quiet for a moment and drift with me, not forward, but backward, far beyond the world of microblades and makeup tutorials, into an era where beauty whispered not of boldness, but of silence and surrender. Picture yourself standing before a mirror of polished metal in a cold stone chamber, candlelight flickering against the wall, and imagine that your face is not quite your own. It is a canvas for transformation, for transcendence. In the medieval world, beauty was not defined by sharp cheekbones or vibrant lashes, but by the solemn architecture of the face, and at the center of that aesthetic empire stood the high forehead. It was not merely a feature, it was a statement, a noble banner stretched across the brow that declared intellect, piety, and refinement. To possess a vast, smooth forehead was to possess a kind of quiet power, a cultivated detachment from the vulgarities of labor or flesh. This was not the face of someone who worked the land. This was the visage of someone who read scripture by moonlight and contemplated eternity while staring serenely from a castle turret. And so, to attain this elevated elegance, women began the slow and deliberate erasure of the face as nature had drawn it. Eyebrows, those now celebrated markers of expression, were considered unseemly intrusions on the grand canvas of the forehead. They were plucked, waxed, pumiced, and, in some cases, literally burned away with potions made from quick lime, vinegar, or even arsenic. Some resorted to creams crafted with strange medieval alchemy, blends of cat dung, powdered eggshells, or leeches soaked in vinegar, each promising to banish the unwanted growth and leave behind the pristine surface of divine beauty. But it didn't end there. Hairlines, too, were redrawn. Scalp hair was sometimes plucked an inch at a time, pushing the natural boundary of the face higher and higher until the forehead seemed to float endlessly above the eyes, a pale horizon of imagined intelligence. Grooming manuals of the time offered detailed guidance on achieving this expansive look, turning personal care into a process that flirted constantly with pain and even disfigurement. Artists of the time enshrined this aesthetic in portraiture, women gazing outward with calm, unreadable expressions, their faces framed by tight-fitting hoods, veils, or the towering hennins that visually extended the head even further skyward. These weren't just fashion choices. They were strategic components of a unified aesthetic vision, one that erased individuality in favor of serenity, vastness, and virtue. In literature and court poetry, these high foreheads were praised with almost mystical devotion, likened to snowy fields, lunar light, or the gentle curve of marble temples. And for those who lacked the tools, time, or pain tolerance to fully commit, there were tricks. Foreheads were artificially elevated using drawn-on hairlines, clever headbands, or draped fabrics that masked where the real brow once lived. This was contouring in its rawest form, not with brushes or shimmer, but with absence, fabric, and smoke. The goal was not enhancement, but elimination. Eyebrows, in this worldview, were not features to shape. They were weeds to be plucked from the garden of the face. Their presence disrupted the sanctity of the forehead, so they were removed with almost religious fervor. Unlike today's brow pencils and microblading pens, there was no path back, only commitment to the blank canvas, and hope that your dedication would not end in burns or permanent scarring. Yet for many medieval women, that risk was simply part of the ritual. After all, what was a little facial melting in the pursuit of beauty that whispered of heaven? 3. The sacred face of Browless angels and blushing saints. Let your mind quiet as we descend deeper into the folds of time, into a world where beauty did not shout but whispered softly through veils of ritual and restraint. Imagine a mirror not made of glass, but of polished bronze, dim and distorted, casting back a version of your face that is not quite you. Eerily still, stripped of expression, elevated beyond the earthly. In the medieval vision of beauty, the ideal face was not a celebration of the self, but a surrender of it. Smooth forehead stretched high and uninterrupted, eyes framed by blank skin, eyebrows erased as if they had never existed. This was no fleeting trend. It was a visual theology, echoed in illuminated manuscripts and oil portraits, where noble women stare back with serene detachment or, depending on the shadows, an almost spectral eeriness. Art immortalized this look not as eccentricity, but as elegance. Across much of Europe, the absence of brows became synonymous with refinement, a signal that once beauty was sculpted by intention rather than nature. Yet, as with all things, regional differences crept in. Traces of the Byzantine and Middle Eastern aesthetic filtered through trade routes and returning crusaders, softening the uniformity. In some regions, slender or lightly arched brows remained acceptable, delicate enough not to offend the era's love for ethereal restraint. Still, for many, the rule held, if your eyebrows were visible, you were dangerously close to looking mortal. Men, too, were not immune. Courtiers sometimes groomed their brows in pursuit of a clean, polished presence, though total removal was rare, unless perhaps lost to illness or an overly passionate theological argument. Beneath all of this was a guiding principle. Medieval beauty was never about realism. It was about crafting a symbol, a living icon. Just as angels in illuminated texts and church frescoes floated browless in divine calm, so too did noble women strive to evoke that same celestial distance. And yet, even the blank canvas of the medieval face was allowed a faint breath of life, just a hint. A soft blush, barely there, like the bloom of embarrassment from a whispered compliment or the flush of cold air on a winter walk. A subtle rose tint on the cheeks signaled youth, vitality, and quiet fertility. But it had to look accidental, never deliberate, lest vanity, the sin that turned angels to demons, be suspected. Applying rouge was at best tolerated and at worst condemned. The church watched carefully, and while nobility might enjoy certain theological loopholes, common women had to improvise in hushed tones and dim corners. Beetroot, crushed berries, mulberries, even cochineal. Yes, the deep red pigment made from insects were mashed into makeshift tints, dabbed on with cloth or bare fingers. Others relied on the simplest method, rubbing the cheeks vigorously to coax blood to the surface, an act of desperate honesty when cosmetics meant suspicion. The wealthy had access to more potent concoctions, red lead, cinnabar, powdered minerals, luxurious and lethal. But death, in this equation, was always an acceptable collateral for beauty. And yet, even in death, one had to appear modest. If the color was too bold, it could invite accusations of vanity, immorality, or worst of all, imitation of French courtiers and scandalous women. Blush was meant to be whispered, not seen. Praise for one's complexion had to be denied with feigned confusion or blamed on the breeze. Even within convent walls, a faint dab of berry tint might appear on feast days, a small act of defiant devotion wrapped in the language of humility. In this carefully choreographed theater of appearance, every feature was curated to hint at grace while hiding effort. Beauty was not personal, it was performative, and in the medieval world, to look angelic was to erase the self, inch by inch, until only the illusion remained. Golden threads and sacred tresses, the medieval pursuit of holy hair. Close your eyes and let the hum of the world fall away for just a moment. Imagine yourself in a sunlit courtyard centuries ago. The air warm with the scent of herbs and stone dust, where mirrors were rare. But beauty was sacred, and the color of your hair could speak volumes about your virtue, your status, your desirability, even your soul. In medieval Europe, hair was not merely a personal feature. It was a spiritual asset, a divine billboard proclaiming purity, youth, and grace. And among all the shades that might crown a woman's head, none was more exalted than blonde, shimmering, celestial, almost impossible to maintain, and therefore more precious. Blonde hair was the favored hue of poetry and prayer, the golden standard of angelic allure. The Virgin Mary herself, though born in a land of dark-haired women, was often painted as golden-haired, symbolism trumping geography, as beauty in this world was not about realism, but radiance. To be born blonde was to be born favored, but time and age have little regard for such privileges. As natural lightness faded, women turned to a blend of household alchemy and patience bordering on divine penance. Recipes to restore this saintly shimmer included chamomile, saffron, ash, lye, and honey, sometimes steeped in sun, sometimes steeped in substances best left unnamed, urine being a favored, if unsettling, ingredient. The method, known as sunbasking, required hours of exposure under the open sky, an ironic contradiction for a society that prized pale skin but demanded celestial hair. It was a delicate balance, to glow like an angel without tanning like a farmer. But texture mattered just as much as tone. The ideal hair was long, loose, and gently wavy, cascading like light from heaven, a symbol of untouched innocence. But this privilege of display was reserved strictly for the unmarried. Once a woman took vows, either of marriage or the cloth, her hair was swiftly hidden, braided and wrapped beneath layers of cloth as if it had suddenly become dangerous. The act of veiling wasn't simply fashion. It was theology woven into linen. A married woman's hair became a guarded secret, tucked beneath nets, veils, wimples, and kifs, forming a complex architecture of concealment meant to signal virtue and humility. Modesty, practicality, and a fair dose of social survival all lived in these layers. A close-fitting coif might anchor the style over which a veil was pinned, beneath which a wimple framed the face and throat, altogether transforming a radiant blonde into a beige mosaic of obedience. Yet, as always, modesty gave way to magnificence. Fashion finds its cracks even in austerity. Embroidered nets, jeweled pins, silk-threaded braids, and even tiny bells adorned these coverings, turning modesty into a subtle parade of status. Some women, bold in their restraint, let curls peek from beneath translucent veils. Technically hidden, spiritually ambiguous, socially strategic. Meanwhile, poets sang of golden locks braided like ropes of sunlight, and painters imagined noble women with tresses that poured like spun wheat across velvet shoulders, even if in real life those locks were hidden behind 3 layers of linen and theological disapproval. Men, too, entered this golden mythology. Thick fair hair was a sign of youth and nobility, often immortalized in song and art as knights with wind-swept manes riding into glory. For both sexes, hair held power. It could seduce, sanctify, or scandalize, depending on how and when it was revealed. In many ways, a woman's hair was her reputation, and once she entered the realm of marriage or religious life, the covering of that hair was as much a ritual as the wedding itself. But rebellion shimmered quietly beneath the rules. A stray curl, a flash of blonde beneath sheer fabric, a scent of chamomile or honey clinging to the air, it was enough to remind the world that beauty, even wrapped in linen and silence, never really disappears. 5. Crowning heights, the towering symbolism of medieval headwear. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a candlelit hall, the air heavy with incense and murmurs, velvet brushing stone, and above the sea of bowed heads, one thing rises, tall, majestic, unmistakably absurd, yet unmistakably powerful. This is not just fashion, this is declaration. In the realm of medieval beauty, one truth loomed, literally, above all others. Height equaled nobility, and the head became the battleground where status stretched skyward. By the 15th century, among the elite women of Europe, beauty was measured not merely by complexion or braid, but by altitude. Enter the hennin, that unforgettable conical headpiece that appeared to be part steeple, part aspiration. These towering creations, particularly adored by the French and Burgundian courts, soared as high as 2 feet or more, often veiled in flowing gauze that trailed like holy smoke. They were not hats in the practical sense, but monuments of silk, velvet, and brocade, their frames stiffened with wire and ambition. To wear one was to visually rise above the common crowd, your forehead elongated, your neck strained, your very presence elevated. Getting one's hair beneath a hennin was its own small engineering feat. Braids twisted and coiled within the cone, or more extremely, sections of the forehead were shaved to make room and highlight the smooth, sculpted expanse so loved by the fashion gods of the time. These headpieces rarely offered comfort, but that wasn't the point. Like many medieval beauty standards, they were performances of discipline, money, and submission to the artifice of status, and the hennin was merely the most famous of its family. Women also flirted with heart-shaped escaffions, wide, curved structures that turned heads into the shape of ornate chalices, or butterfly hennins, where fabric wings spread from wire frames like some divine metamorphosis in motion. These styles were theatrical, symbolic, and occasionally impractical. Candle flames, door frames, and weather were constant hazards. But for those who walked the marble floors of power, drama was part of the allure. Simpler women, especially those of the working classes, wore humbler headdresses, linen caps, veils, or basic circlets, unencumbered by height or spectacle, but rich in modesty and function. The church, unsurprisingly, frowned upon these extravagant head ladders, preaching that such ostentation was a gateway to sin, pride, and moral ruin, not to mention cervical misalignment. But like many things that sparkle and defy gravity, the hennin endured, whispering promises of elegance, refinement, and the social supremacy of literally looking down on others. And while men didn't climb quite as high in their fashion, they had their own flourishes: plumed caps, fur-lined hoods, and shoes so sharply pointed they could probably settle a duel. In this elaborate theater of form and illusion, the higher your hat, the closer to nobility you stood, if not to heaven itself. 6. The fragile ideal. A body built for elegance, not endurance. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the hush of a medieval chamber, light filtering through stained glass, and the soft rustle of silk as a figure glides. Not walks, but glides across a stone floor. In this world, strength is not celebrated, curves are not flaunted, and vigor is not the goal. The ideal woman was not sculpted for action, but shaped for observation, reverence, and perhaps the occasional well-timed swoon. Her body was an extension of the divine aesthetic, slender, gentle, and touched by the ethereal, as if she subsisted not on food, but on moonlight, rosewater, and sighs. The beauty ideal was soft and faint, with narrow shoulders, a high waistline, and a willowy silhouette that whispered of poetic melancholy rather than physical vitality. No one expected her to chop wood or carry water. Her arms bore the weight of bracelets, not buckets. Dresses were tailored to elongate her form, waistlines cinched just below the bust to create the illusion of length, grace, and fragility. Tight-laced girdles and early bodices sculpted the figure, subtly but firmly shaping the torso into a gentle taper that suggested delicacy without danger. Yet, A careful balance had to be struck. Too thin, and one risked looking like a plague victim. A touch of fullness in the cheeks or hips was not just acceptable, it was desirable, signaling health, fertility, and the reassuring promise that you might survive the winter without becoming poetry yourself. Beauty manuals from the time were filled with dietary oddities that read more like a garden spell book than a nutritional guide. Fennel to aid digestion, rose petals to perfume the breath, wine to coax a healthy flush to the cheeks, and poultry only if it still hinted at flight. Protein was not a daily concern. Appearance was. For men, the story was somewhat different. Nobility could afford a bit more substance, broad shoulders and the quiet power to wield a sword, but even here, the ideal leaned toward the elegant rather than the rugged. Lean lines, refined movement, and upright posture marked a gentleman's form, separating him from the laboring masses whose muscle came from work, not heritage. In both cases, the message was clear. The body was not a tool, but a canvas, and its most admired form was one that seemed untouched by effort, as though the soul within was far more weighted than the flesh. 7. The gaze divine, eyes as mirrors of virtue and mystery. Let your breath slow for a moment and picture the stillness of a medieval chapel, the flicker of a candle, the scent of beeswax, the rustle of embroidered sleeves, as a pair of eyes glance upward, soft and knowing, heavy with meaning and light with mystery. In the world of medieval beauty, where subtlety reigned and modesty wrapped itself around every gesture, a woman's eyes became her quietest and most potent weapon. They were not simply windows to the soul. They were portals of virtue, silent scripts of piety, and soft declarations of refinement. The ideal gaze was not bold or sharp, but luminous, large, and gentle, as if the eyes themselves had endured spiritual sorrow and emerged from it with a holy glow. Medieval poets adored this vision, eyes like dew upon divine petals, orbs aglow with chastity and quiet wisdom, wells of devotion deep enough to drown in softly. Blue and gray eyes were often favored in the north, symbols of innocence and celestial connection, while darker eyes, especially in southern Europe, carried their own reverence, depth, warmth, lineage, and the implication of noble blood and a fine dowry. Enhancing the eyes was more intuition than technique, more candle placement than cosmetics. Without access to modern tools, women turned to soot, charcoal, or powdered herbs to darken the lashes and accentuate the gaze, though this often came with stinging eyes or a smoky blur. Some stood near firelight to catch the glow, while others tilted their heads downward so the eyes peeked out from beneath lowered lids, suggesting modesty, wisdom, and just a hint of medieval flirtation. Tears, curiously, were admired too. Slightly shimmering eyes spoke of emotion, piety, and an openness to divine sorrow. One could simulate this look by reading poetry near a hearth, enduring mild embarrassment in public, or simply allowing the smoke from candles to blur the line between spiritual and aesthetic experience. Eye contact, of course, was a careful choreography. A steady stare could scandalize, a darting glance might betray guilt or madness, and the ideal was always somewhere in between, a fleeting upward look from beneath lashes, as if to say, I know the Psalms by heart, but I won't boast about it. In this delicate language of gazes and glances, the medieval eye was more than a feature. It was a performance of soul, sanctity, and silent allure. 8. The whisper of roses, medieval beauty, breath, and the quiet art of scent. Close your eyes and step with me into the hush of a forgotten time, where beauty was not loud or defined by mirrors, but curated through shadows, scent, and the subtle tilt of a smile. In the medieval world, attraction did not scream across rooms. It whispered through veils, lingered in glances, and clung to the air like the trace of rosemary on silk. Yet for all the courtly poems praising eyes like stars and hair like gold-threaded halos, one thing rarely received poetic mention: breath. When a knight penned verses to his lady's lips, he was careful not to mention what escaped between them. The reason? Medieval dental hygiene was more theory than practice, and minty freshness had yet to be dreamed into existence. Still, a sweet mouth was quietly valued. It hinted at youth, health, and a diet that hadn't involved garlic-soaked eels. Women did what they could with what they had, chewing on parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, or sticks of cinnamon. These natural fresheners softened the breath and added a hint of flavor, functioning as a rustic precursor to gum, a tiny ritual of refinement carried out beneath layers of linen and lace. Those with access to apothecaries dabbled in more ambitious remedies, herbal rinses made from sage, vinegar, myrrh, and mint, though these were applied with discretion. Mouths were private things, opened only in quiet prayer or soft-spoken conversation, rarely in laughter, and never in public indulgence. Toothbrushing as we know it didn't exist. Instead, a cloth might be rubbed over the teeth, chalk or crushed herbs might be applied, or chew sticks, fibrous twigs, used to scrub and soothe, often doubling as something to fiddle with while your suitor tried out his latest love verse. And though bad breath was universal, it wasn't a scandal. Everyone endured it to some degree, tucked behind social etiquette and sheer survival instincts. The noblewoman's goal was to minimize offense, not eliminate it. Hence, conversations happened at a respectful distance. Kisses were rare and reserved for protocol or poetry. And the ever-popular pomander made its appearance, a scented orb filled with cloves, cinnamon, sage, or powder of roses, hung from the waist or pinned to a gown, waved discreetly when the moment required a whiff of divine distraction. If breath was carefully avoided in poetry, teeth were nearly erased. A beautiful smile was quietly admired, but open-mouthed grins were considered unrefined, if not downright alarming. Tooth decay was common, thanks to a diet rich in starches and low in dental care, and by one's 30s, teeth often ranged from slightly dubious to actively haunting. Sugar had not yet flooded Europe, but bread, mead, and porridges were enough to turn enamel to memory. Dental care was primitive at best and torturous at worst. Removal involved force, prayer, and pliers. Despite this, a clean, white smile was seen as a mark of youth and divine favor. Women brushed with ground sage, salt, coral powder, or even crushed bone, gritty, abrasive rituals that did little to protect enamel but helped scrape away surface grime. Yet the smile remained a restrained gesture, demure, lips closed, and almost meditative, a visual whisper of virtue rather than a declaration of joy. Even saints in medieval art rarely bared their teeth, their holiness expressed through light and posture, not through gleaming molars. Men, too, were expected to embody a particular kind of beauty, structured, lean, and nobly indifferent. The ideal man was tall, broad-shouldered, and refined, not muscled like a peasant, but strong in a ceremonial, non-utilitarian sort of way. His beauty lay in stillness, in posture, in the noble ability to appear powerful without the vulgarity of action. A knight could be admired for his swordsmanship, but only if he didn't look like he actually chopped wood. The face mattered. High cheekbones, a chiseled jaw, and a symmetrical nose were signs of lineage and grace. Hair, typically shoulder length, was carefully maintained, sometimes even curled with heated irons or perfumed with herbal rinses to give it shine and shape. Facial hair was styled, not grown in chaos. A trimmed beard or smooth jawline framed the face depending on fashion and region, but never allowed to look wild or unintentional. And to dress the body was to sculpt the illusion. Padded shoulders and tailored tunics shaped the silhouette, and posture completed the transformation. A nobleman stood tall, glided rather than walked, and radiated an air of practiced disinterest, as if beauty were something bestowed by birthright, not pursuit. He might smell faintly of lavender, cloves, or rosewater, anything but sweat or stable, which brings us to the final sense, the invisible aura of scent, that most intimate and ephemeral layer of medieval beauty. In an age before deodorant and indoor plumbing, scent became both challenge and art. Bathing happened, but inconsistently. Some bathed frequently, especially in early medieval times, while others did so only when the weather, occasion, and moral codes allowed. The church's growing discomfort with nudity in public bathhouses dampened enthusiasm, and plague fears didn't help. When in doubt, people turned to dry bathing, wiping the body with cloth, dusting with powders, and layering on scented oils or herbal waters to mask the evidence of daily life. The pomander, again, played a central role. Worn like jewelry, it held dried herbs and spices and functioned as both perfume and defense. Other tactics included perfumed gloves, scented handkerchiefs, and combs soaked in floral oils. Hair might be washed with vinegar infusions or brushed with rose water, leaving a trail of pleasant ambiguity. Garments were layered strategically, with linen worn closest to the skin to absorb sweat, then replaced and washed more frequently than the heavier wool or silk outer layers. Some even placed dried petals or herbal sachets between layers of clothing or inside shoes. Beds were freshened with lavender, rosemary, and bay leaves, ensuring that even sleep had a scent of grace. In this world, beauty was not loud. It was quiet, built on whispers of scent, glimpses of light, and the careful curation of what was shown and what was hidden. It was not about being flawless, but about seeming otherworldly, untouched by hardship, even when everyone, quite literally, reeked of it. It was about crafting the illusion of divinity while managing the unavoidable humanity beneath. And that delicate balance between decay and desire, grit and grace, is what made medieval beauty not only fascinating, but achingly real. 9. The virtue veil. When beauty became a moral balancing act. Close your eyes for a moment and step softly into the candle-lit corridors of medieval thought, where every glance, every curl of the lip, and every pale cheek held more than aesthetic value. They held judgment. In this world, beauty was never just a matter of appearance. It was a mirror reflecting divine favor or moral failure, a riddle wrapped in silk and suspicion. A flawless face, clear skin, symmetrical features, a pale, untouched glow, was often read as a sign of purity, grace, and even a blessing from God. To be beautiful was to be touched by something celestial, a quiet proof that your soul was as luminous as your complexion. Poets praised it, painters immortalized it, and preachers endorsed it, as long as it remained unaware of itself. Because the very moment beauty was acknowledged, the ground shifted. Awareness became vanity, and vanity was a gateway sin. If a woman dared to notice her reflection, or, worse, enhance it with pigment or veil, She risked inviting suspicion, scandal, or something far darker. In the sermons and stories of the age, beauty was power, and power in the wrong hands, meaning feminine ones, was deeply unsettling. A fluttering lash, a painted lip, or the sin of looking slightly too radiant near someone else's husband could brand a woman immoral or even infernal. Beauty, in this sense, was seen as dangerous, either a divine test or a diabolical trick. The fear of female allure leading men to ruin was not only widespread, but weaponized. Women were warned that their very attractiveness might be the tool of the devil, a glamour to tempt the righteous into sin. At the same time, those with less fortunate features weren't safe either. Plainness or disfigurement was sometimes interpreted as divine displeasure, punishment for sins known or unknown, or simply a cosmic misfortune. In this landscape, there was no winning, only balance. Be beautiful but unaware, be graceful but never seductive. Reflect virtue without inviting envy, and above all, do not outshine anyone who matters more politically than you. In medieval Europe, beauty was a tightrope, strung between heaven and hell, virtue and vanity, adoration and accusation. To survive it, a woman had to walk that line with silence, subtlety, and just enough powdered lead to look divine, but never dangerous. 10. The silence that endures, the Persian Immortals and the illusion of eternal power. Step softly into the silence of an empire before dawn, where banners ripple in the windless air and 1,000 footfalls sound like none, where power is not shouted, but worn like silk over steel. In this world born of fire and order, the Persian Immortals emerged not simply as warriors, but as instruments, precise, eternal, and unnervingly still. From their inception under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, the Immortals were shaped not just to fight, but to be seen, remembered, and feared. As the Achaemenid Empire stretched its fingers from the deserts of Egypt to the Indus Valley, Cyrus knew conquest alone could not hold what ambition grasped. An empire, to last, needed more than soldiers. It needed an image, constant, unwavering, immortal. And so the Immortals were born. Their strength, Herodotus tells us, always numbered 10,000. One man fell, another rose. No gaps, no mourning, no delay. Whether myth or meticulous management, this illusion of perpetuity forged something stronger than armor. It created an aura. These were not 10,000 men. They were one force, indivisible, untouched by time or loss. To see them was to see the empire breathe. They were not clad in the bronze shine of Greek hoplites. Their beauty was softer, more unnerving. Robes of deep reds and purples, layered over scale armor, woven wicker shields in hand, faces half obscured by felt tiaras that seemed more priestly than martial. Their appearance, so unlike their Western counterparts, was deliberate, psychological warfare. They did not roar into battle. They advanced with terrifying calm, arrows flying in controlled volleys, never breaking formation. To behold them was to watch a curtain fall, elegant, silent, final. Their weaponry was versatile, bows, spears, short swords, all suited to flexibility and grace over brute strength. They moved swiftly, adjusted easily, and endured long campaigns with minimal complaint. They didn't look like death, but they marched with its precision. Their strength lay not in singular might, but in absolute unity. 10,000 identities folded into one seamless myth. To become an immortal was to surrender the self. Recruited from noble Persian, Median, or Elamite families, or elevated from proven loyalty, boys began training young, taught to ride, to shoot, to withstand pain and hunger, to march in perfect rhythm, and above all, to obey. Individual glory was not the goal. Uniformity was sacred. A soldier who stood out too much was swiftly corrected. Even their daily lives were structured in sacred monotony. Meals were measured, modest, flatbread, meat, wine, dates, fuel, not luxury. Luxuries soften the will, and the Immortals were not meant to soften. Their homes, clothing, and food were state-provided not out of generosity, but control. They belonged not to blood, but to crown. Even their families understood this. They could marry, yes, but they could be summoned without warning, vanish from home in an hour, and be expected never to falter. To hesitate was to vanish, replaced without ceremony, because the number must never waver. Immortality required it. When not campaigning, the Immortals were the Empire's pulse. They guarded palaces, stood behind thrones, and flanked the king like shadows. They weren't just warriors, they were watchers. They saw dissent before it spoke. They quelled rebellion before it rose. Their stillness was as potent as their strike. To see them in a hall was to feel your heartbeat checked. To see them on the road was to know the king was near. And to see them on the battlefield was to understand that Persia did not forget, did not forgive, and never bled where it could burn instead. Under Darius the Great, the Immortals were refined, formalized, perfected. When Darius seized the throne in 522 BCE amid the chaos of assassination and revolt, he used the Immortals not just to crush enemies, but to legitimize his rule. They paraded at festivals, flanked him in stone reliefs, and marched into capitals as walking declarations. The empire is intact, and it always will be. He expanded their tactical range. They became more than ceremonial guard or shock infantry. Darius integrated them into Persian combined arms warfare, training them alongside cavalry, archers, and chariot corps. They learned siege tactics, formation shifts, and terrain flexibility. They weren't brute force attackers. They were the scalpel when the army needed precision and terror with ritual grace. Their presence in places like Elam and Babylon wasn't just punishment. It was proof of omnipresence. Rebellion might rise, but it would always find 10,000 pairs of eyes waiting. And carved across the stone of Persepolis, row upon row, their image endures, not as individuals, but as icons. Identical faces, identical stance, the faces of order itself. This was propaganda as architecture. These men do not age, do not die, and they are always watching. Their myth met its greatest challenge in 480 BCE at the mountain pass of Thermopylae. Here, myth and memory collided. Xerxes, son of Darius, led a vast invasion of Greece. And with him marched the Immortals, his vanguard, the 10,000 who did not die. Their name alone sent whispers across city-states. But at Thermopylae, the terrain betrayed them. Against the narrow stone corridor, Greek defenders, famously 300 Spartans and allies, held firm. Xerxes expected the Immortals to break them, but the geography turned their grace into limitation. Their bows lost range, their unity was pressed inward, their silence echoed back in defeat. For 2 days they fought. Beautiful, disciplined, ineffective. They could not break the Greek phalanx head-on. Their legend cracked, but did not collapse. Even in failure, their aura endured. They were still the king's chosen, still symbols of power, refined, if not unstoppable. To be an immortal was not just to fight. It was to become part of something that did not allow for endings. They were the ritualized edge of Persian authority, draped in silk, and backed by iron. Their presence outlived their breath. Their myth outlived their campaigns. And long after the empire's heart stopped beating, the echo of their march lingered. Footfalls of 1,000 men who never truly left, only changed names. Their discipline, their composure, their terrifying calm became a template for elite forces across history. Not because they were gods, but because they made themselves machinery. Not immortal in flesh, but in function. In the silence they carved on the battlefield. In the order they carried like a sacred fire. In the way they proved, without ever needing to speak, that the true terror of empire is not violence. It is permanence. Let your thoughts drift for a moment beyond time, beyond the flickering edge of history, into a space where silence speaks louder than swords and order marches heavier than chaos. Picture a line that never breaks, a presence that never fades, a shadow that advances without sound. This is not a fantasy born of myth or magic, but a system, a machine built from discipline and human will, an elite force woven so seamlessly into the fabric of empire that their absence was never allowed to be visible. The Persian Immortals were not just soldiers. They were an idea, a statement carved into the world by empires that understood one of the most haunting truths of power. To rule, you must not only win, but endure. From their creation under Cyrus the Great, they embodied that endurance. The Immortals were conceived in the earliest breath of the Achaemenid Empire, not merely as guards or warriors, but as the living projection of imperial authority. With 10,000 men always on duty, never more, never less. They were crafted to represent a force that did not diminish. Every fallen soldier was replaced without pause, every rotation seamless, every face absorbed into a structure too smooth to show fracture. Herodotus may have attached the word immortal to them with poetic flourish, but the concept was no illusion. It was a deliberate logistical masterpiece. Immortality was not measured in blood, but in bureaucracy. What made the Immortals formidable was not just their training or weaponry, though both were sophisticated. It was their system. 1,000 men under each Hazarapatis, 10 such units forming the full legion, all recorded, supplied, and managed with precision so relentless it could be mistaken for ritual. Recruitment began early. Young boys from noble Persian, Median, or Elamite families were trained in military academies attached to the court. They were taught obedience before ambition, cohesion before glory. Marching, archery, formation movement, silent discipline, these were the hallmarks of their education. To stand out too much was to risk dismissal. To deviate was to vanish. Even their daily routines, meals, drills, rest, were controlled, optimized for stamina, not indulgence. The empire didn't just want warriors, it wanted symbols. The Immortals were adorned in embroidered tunics layered over scale armor, armed with short spears, bows, and swords, and veiled in silence. Their signature headdress, the soft felt tiara, could obscure the face, creating a sense of anonymity and mystery. They moved as one, spoke as one, and appeared as a single will. 10,000 steps synchronized, 10,000 hands ready to strike. This was the heart of their terror. They didn't seem human. Greek hoplites were loud, brutal, personal, each man a statement of bravery. The Immortals were faceless endurance. They didn't cry out in battle. They didn't celebrate victory. They simply advanced. When one fell, another stepped forward. No mourning, no names remembered. This wasn't merely discipline. It was theater. The illusion of eternal presence was as devastating to morale as any sword. This illusion cracked briefly at Thermopylae. In the narrow pass against the Spartans, the Immortals' shorter spears failed to penetrate the dense Greek phalanx. Confined, stripped of their mobility and archery range, they suffered losses. Herodotus, ever eager to elevate Greek valor, claimed they fared no better than ordinary troops. But even in failure, the Immortals adapted, they regrouped, and they returned. Because their purpose was never to win every battle, it was to never seem gone. Their battlefield presence was matched by their diplomatic function. Immortals were deployed not just to fight, but to be seen. Their appearance in foreign courts, silent, opulent, precise, was a political message. They embodied Persian control, refinement, and menace. When ambassadors entered cities from Greece to Babylon, Immortals often accompanied them, not as protection, but as performance. Their fine robes, gilded weapons, and composed silence were calculated to unnerve. In satrapies, they were stationed as reminders of central authority, rarely interfering but always watching. A whisper of rebellion might bring their knock at a governor's door. Their presence was a form of surveillance, a velvet-clad blade always within reach. At court, they doubled as ceremonial guards and royal enforcers, standing behind thrones during festivals, yet also tasked with observing nobles, reporting suspicions, and enforcing decrees. Some historians view them as early instruments of internal intelligence, silent guarantors of loyalty. Their gaze was more feared than their weapons, for it meant the king saw all. But time rusts even the sharpest edges. As the Achaemenid Empire aged, the machine that kept the Immortals immortal began to stutter. Under kings like Artaxerxes and Darius III, discipline faltered. Recruitment became politicized. Nobles placed favored sons into ranks once reserved for the exceptional. The result was slow but corrosive. Cohesion without soul. Ceremony without strength. When Alexander the Great invaded in 334 BCE, the Immortals were still deployed, still in their gleaming tunics, still disciplined. But they were no longer the ironclad force of Cyrus and Darius I. At Gaugamela, in 331 BCE, they fought bravely but could not withstand Macedonian tactics. Outflanked and outpaced, they broke. The legend fractured. For centuries, the name had conjured fear, but now it conjured memory. The system of instant replacement had failed. The sacred number was no longer preserved. When Alexander took Persepolis, the Immortals were not there to stop him. The myth had finally ended, but not its legacy. Though they vanished from the battlefield, the Immortals never truly disappeared. Elements of their structure resurfaced under later empires. The Sassanids revived elite corps, sometimes called Immortals by Greek and Roman historians. In Rome, Byzantine scholars admired their precision. Arab chroniclers spoke of 10,000 elite guards who once marched in silence beneath Persian suns. Even Napoleon studied Persian logistics and praised their organization. Their legend, passed down and reshaped, became a model, not because they were invincible, but because they represented the power of discipline refined into myth. Modern media often reduces them to shadows, monsters, faceless demons. But the truth is far more haunting. They were men, deeply trained, carefully controlled, and bound by a machine that turned them into something greater than themselves. They didn't need magic to become immortal. They had precision. They had silence. They had a system that erased weakness before it was seen. In a world where empires collapse and memories fade, the Immortals endure. Not because they could not be killed, but because they taught the world a truth that remains as relevant today as it was in the time of kings. That the most terrifying power of all is not brute strength, but the illusion that it never ends. 11. Warrior. Women. The untold history of female power and resistance. Before myth could take form and legend be written, the winds of the Eurasian steppe whispered of women who rode like thunder and struck like lightning. Long before the Greeks conjured tales of fierce Amazons, there were the Scythians, nomadic warriors who carved their names into the land from the Black Sea to the Alai Mountains. In a world where most ancient women were tethered to hearth and home, the Scythian woman was astride a horse, bow in hand, her eyes sharp as the falcon's flight. They were not mere accompaniments to male warriors. They were warriors, leaders, hunters, defenders. Greek historians like Herodotus, steeped in patriarchal traditions, could barely comprehend the sight of entire tribes where women refused to marry unless they had slain an enemy. His words, originally written as curiosities, have since found a chorus of validation in the soil of the steppe. Burial mounds, kurgans, spread across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, have unearthed not ceremonial symbols, but instruments of war clutched by the bones of women. One lay with an arrowhead embedded in her spine, her armor scarred, and her grave richly adorned. Not in show, but in testament. Life on the steppe demanded relentless mobility and unyielding resilience, and Scythian girls were raised under the same code as boys: to hunt, to ride, to fight. Leather trousers, tattoos, steel, on horseback, under a hail of arrows, they were indistinguishable from their male comrades. Gender melted away beneath armor and ash. This was not anomaly, but identity. Yet off the battlefield, the Scythians still maintained roles of ritual and maternal care. War and womanhood were not contradictions, but complements. The myths of Amazonian might may well have been born from Greek soldiers staggering home from Scythian skirmishes, spinning truth into epic. But while the Amazons of fable vanished into legend, the Scythians left evidence in sinew and steel. They fought Persians, confounded Greeks, and defied Macedonian conquest. And they did so not as exceptions, but as the embodiment of their culture's fierce egalitarianism. Far from the frozen steppes, in the humid heart of West Africa, another army of warrior women rose, not in myth, but in thunderous reality. In the small yet defiant kingdom of Dahomey, now modern-day Benin, there existed an elite military force that would come to haunt the dreams of colonizers and conquerors alike: the Agogi. Europeans called them the Dahomey Amazons, unable to reconcile their might with their femininity. But these women were no echoes of Greek fiction. By the 18th and 19th centuries, they had become the royal guard of Dahomey's king, disciplined, lethal, unflinching. Once perhaps elephant hunters or palace guards, they were forged into warriors through brutal training. Selected as young girls for their strength or unbreakable spirit, the Agogi were severed from family, sworn to celibacy, and reshaped into weapons of the crown. They sparred with real blades, dashed through thorn-strewn obstacle courses, and drilled until fear itself retreated. Muskets, machetes, psychological warfare, these were their tools. One French officer, hardened by colonial campaigns, could only describe with shaken awe how one Agogi slit a man's throat and calmly cleaned her blade. These were not mascots of resistance. They were its spearhead. They ambushed French troops in the dark, launched raids with silent precision, and fought with a fury that forced France's imperial machine to halt. and re-strategize. They did not just protect their kingdom, they advised their king, helped shape diplomacy, and held the authority of the sword in a society that otherwise reserved power for men. Their defeat by the French was not the end of their legend. It was the beginning of their legacy, immortalized not only in folklore, but in the very blueprint for modern warrior women in global culture. And yet, the story of female ferocity doesn't end in Africa's forests or Eurasia's plains. It rides into the shadowed chronicles of medieval Japan, where one name glows like a blade in the dark: Tomo Gozen. In the twilight of the 12th century, during the Genpei War that birthed the first shogunate, she emerged not as a symbolic heroine, but as a true battlefield commander. History records her not just in whispers, but in battle cries, especially in the war epic Heike Monogatari, where she is first praised for her beauty, then lionized for her strength. She was no idle consort. Trained as a swordswoman and archer, Tomo Gozen led troops into battle and claimed enemies by the dozen. Riding under the banner of Minamoto no Yoshinaka, her lord and perhaps her lover, she fought not on the fringes, but at the heart of the storm. Her prowess with blade and bow was matched only by her unshakable composure. Here again, we see not contradiction, but convergence. Beauty and bloodshed. Femininity and force. Like the Scythians and the Agogi before her, Tomo Gozen defied the neat confines of her gendered world, stepping instead into the chaos of history with a weapon in hand and no apology in her eyes. These women, Scythian, Agogi, samurai, were not myths. They were warnings. That power has no gender, and history forgets it only at its peril. History does not always remember its fiercest warriors with statues or textbooks. Sometimes their stories slip between the cracks of conquest and silence, their names whispered only by wind and memory. But beneath the layers of patriarchal tradition, beyond the scrolls written by victors, there lies a hidden history, carved not in stone, but in fire. One of women who did not wait for freedom to be granted, but seized it by the sword. They did not fit the roles they were born into. They remade them. They were not born legendary. They bled, fought, and broke the world open until it remembered them. Let us begin where steel first met silence, where one woman, standing amid betrayal and encirclement, became immortal not through words, but action. At the Battle of Owazu in 1184, as Minamoto no Yoshinaka faced defeat from rival Minamoto forces, his death seemed inevitable. Yet Tomoe Gozen did not flee. She remained, blade drawn, fury focused. In a moment that dances between myth and memory, she reportedly dismounted a charging enemy, wrestled him to the earth, and beheaded him without hesitation. Then, with a calm that chills across time, she mounted her horse and vanished into chaos. No one knows for certain what became of her. Some say she was forced into marriage, others that she became a nun, withdrawing into silence. Some claim she returned to the shadows from which legends are born. But what remains unquestioned is her impact. In a society rigid with hierarchy, Tomo Gozen stood as an anomaly. Grace fused with ferocity, loyal yet independent, a commander not by privilege, but by will. She fought not merely for Yoshinaka, but for the right to exist as herself in a world that had no place for her kind. Centuries earlier and across a continent, another flame of resistance burned through imperial arrogance. In the 1st century CE, as Rome surged across the known world, a spark ignited in Britannia. Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, watched her world unravel as Roman officials claimed her late husband's lands, flogged her publicly, and violated her daughters. What should have broken her instead forged her into one of Rome's most fearsome enemies. In 60 or 61 CE, she united warring British tribes under a single cause: vengeance. She was no figurehead. Roman accounts describe her as towering and fierce, her flame-red hair billowing as she led her armies from a chariot, spear in hand and eyes alight with wrath. Her warriors swept through Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, burning it to ash, then razed Londinium, leaving over 70,000 Roman settlers and sympathizers dead. Her fury was not chaos. It was strategy. But despite her momentum, Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus regrouped his legions and lured her into a pitched battle where Roman discipline and formation overcame raw numbers. Rather than be captured, Boudica is said to have taken her own life. Rome may have won, but the name Boudica lived on. First as a cautionary tale in Roman texts, then as a symbol of British defiance through the centuries. Her image, crowned and armed, would become an emblem of national resistance, a reminder that one woman's rage can shake an empire. On the wind-swept steppes of Central Asia, another legend was born not of rebellion, but of unshakable strength. Kutulun, great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan, was a warrior princess unlike any the world had seen. Raised in the martial traditions of the Mongols, she excelled in archery, strategy, and most of all, wrestling. In Mongol culture, wrestling was not mere sport. It was honor, and Kutulun mastered it so completely that she vowed only to marry a man who could defeat her in combat. None could. Suitors came bearing herds and gold, wagering everything for her hand, only to be thrown to the ground in front of their peers. It is said she amassed 10,000 horses through these victories alone. Yet her strength wasn't confined to sport. Kutulun rode beside her father Kaidu Khan into battle, commanding troops and breaking enemy lines with terrifying precision. Kaidu considered naming her his successor, a choice that shook the foundations of a male-dominated world. But conservative backlash prevailed, and the title went elsewhere. Still, Kutulun's legend endured, even catching the attention of Marco Polo, who wrote of a warrior woman whose skill rivaled any man's. Later, histories would twist her into romance or folklore, but beneath those layers was truth. She did not rise because permission was granted. She rose because no one could stop her. From the dust of Asia to the villages of France, another warrior woman would rise, not from noble blood, but divine conviction. In 1412, in a tiny village called Domremy, Joan of Arc was born. She could not read or write. She had no title, no army, no weapons. But she claimed to hear the voices of saints who told her she was destined to save France from English rule and crown Charles VII as king. It should have ended with laughter. Instead, it began a revolution. By age 17, Joan had stood before the future king, convinced hardened clergy of her mission, and donned white armor as she rode to Orléans. What followed was nothing short of miraculous. Her arrival galvanized French troops. She led charges, endured wounds, and turned the tide of a war that had seemed hopeless. She wasn't a mascot. She was a tactician, a fighter, a prophet in armor. After freeing Orléans and securing Charles' coronation at Reims, Joan's legend soared. But power attracts enemies. In 1430, she was captured by the Burgundians, sold to the English, and placed on trial by an ecclesiastical court desperate to break her spirit. Her crimes? Heresy, witchcraft, wearing men's clothing. At 19, they burned her alive in the market square of Rouen. But her flame would not be extinguished. Years later, the church reversed her conviction. Centuries later, she was canonized as a saint. Today, she remains an eternal symbol of faith, courage, and righteous defiance. Finally, as the samurai era of Japan neared its twilight in the late 1860s, and the old ways dissolved into modernization, one woman made her final stand. Nakano Takeko, wielding the naginata, a curved pole weapon traditionally used by female warriors, did not fight for a throne, nor for fame. She fought to honor a way of life being dismantled. During the Boshin War, as the imperial forces swept across Japan, she and a group of women known as the Joshitai, an unofficial female combat unit, joined the defense of Aizu. She fought with elegance and fury, cutting down foes even as bullets filled the air. When she was mortally wounded, Nakano reportedly asked her sister to behead her so her body would not be captured. Her grave became a place of reverence. In a time when the samurai class was being erased, Nakano Takeko wrote herself into its final chapter, not as a relic of the past, but as its proud, defiant conclusion. Across cultures, across eras, these women rose not in isolation, but as part of a larger truth. That strength knows no gender, and that war has always been shaped not just by kings and emperors, but by women who dared to pick up a blade and demand to be remembered. Not all legends begin in castles or on thrones. Some are born in the quiet defiance of women who refused to shrink. Not all warriors carry banners into battle. Some carry silence, scars, and a gaze that cuts deeper than any sword. Imagine history not as a record, but as a living battlefield, where the footsteps of men were etched in stone, while the footprints of women were swept away by time. Yet if you listen closely, beyond the noise of official chronicles and the drumbeats of kings, you will hear another rhythm. The steady, unyielding march of warrior women, forgotten by design, remembered by force of will. Their weapons varied: naginata, musket, bow, wisdom, rebellion. But their mission was the same: to protect, to resist, and above all, to be free. These are their stories, stitched together across centuries and continents by a common thread of ferocity and purpose. Born in 1847 to a family steeped in intellectual and martial tradition, Nakano Takeko was no ordinary girl. From an early age, she devoured the Confucian classics, mastered calligraphy, and most importantly, trained in martial arts with an intensity that surpassed her male peers. Her chosen weapon, the naginata, symbolized both elegance and deadly reach. A blade made for those who could fight with grace and fury. Under the instruction of her adoptive father, a revered martial arts master, she honed her skills until even seasoned warriors acknowledged her prowess. By her 20s, Nakano had become an educator, teaching other women the way of the sword. But when the Boshin War erupted in 1868, a civil conflict that threatened to sweep away the old samurai order, she did not remain in the shadows. Forbidden from officially joining the fight, she formed the Joshitai, an unofficial battalion of women warriors. Clad in hakama and armor, they fought not for glory, but to defend Aizu, one of the last strongholds of the Tokugawa shogunate. During the Battle of Aizu, she led charges against imperial forces armed with rifles, wielding her naginata in brutal hand-to-hand combat. When a bullet struck her in the chest, mortally wounding her, she chose death on her terms. She asked her sister to behead her so that her body would not be taken. She was buried with her sword, and her spirit has never left Aizu. Statues now honor her, But no monument can truly capture the fire of a woman who stared modernity in the face and said, "Not yet." In a different war, on a different continent, a different kind of warrior emerged, not from feudal tradition, but from the crucible of global conflict. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, born in 1916 in Ukraine, was a student of history before she became one of its most fearsome makers. When the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, she left university and enlisted, not as a nurse, as officials first suggested, but as a sniper. She would go on to earn 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers, making her the most lethal female sniper in recorded history. Her battlefield was the siege-torn terrain of Odessa and Sevastopol, where she lay still for hours in the freezing mud, waiting with patience forged from iron. Her targets were chosen not at random, but with chilling precision. Commanders, machine gunners, sharpshooters. Her kill list became so notorious that the Soviet government eventually pulled her from combat and sent her on a diplomatic tour across the West. There, she met Eleanor Roosevelt and addressed American audiences, mocking journalists who asked her about makeup rather than marksmanship. After the war, she didn't disappear. She earned her degree, trained future snipers, and lived with the weight of what she had seen and done. Decorated with the Hero of the Soviet Union medal, she remains a figure both revered and feared. A woman who didn't ask to be taken seriously. She simply pulled the trigger and changed the world. Before Takeko, before Pavlichenko, before the world carved spaces for female valor in hindsight, another woman was already wielding both intellect and steel. Born in the late Edo period, Nano, scholar, warrior, teacher, stood as the last true onagata of the samurai world. She too mastered the naginata, but for her, it was not just a tool of war. It was a symbol of balance, discipline, and feminine strength honed to a blade's edge. Raised in a household that revered knowledge and honor in equal measure, Nano did not separate mind and body. She taught young girls not only the sword, but the spirit behind it, preparing them for a world that was changing far too fast. When civil war came, when the Tokugawa shogunate fell, she did not fade. Like Takeko, she took up arms. Like Takeko, she led women into battle. And like so many warrior women before and after, she refused to surrender her dignity, even in death. Her name may not fill textbooks, but her story runs through the veins of every girl who dares to stand tall with weapon or word in hand. Travel further back, to the 1st century CE, and we find Vietnam under the heel of Chinese rule. But resistance stirred, in the form of 2 sisters who would ride into legend. Trung Trak and Trung Ni were born into a noble family but were never content with quiet obedience. When Trak's husband was killed by Chinese authorities, the sisters rose. Riding atop elephants, clad in armor, they rallied tens of thousands to their cause. For 3 years, they ruled an independent state, defying one of the most powerful empires in the world. Their rebellion was ultimately crushed, but they chose death over capture, leaping into a river rather than be paraded in chains. Vietnam remembers them with temples and parades, but outside Southeast Asia, their names are barely spoken. Yet their courage burns eternal, and elephants charge through the pages of history, impossible to ignore once heard. Shift forward to 1900, to West Africa, where the Ashanti Empire faced the might of British colonialism. The British demanded the sacred golden stool, the throne of the Ashanti people, not understanding that they were asking not for furniture, but for sovereignty itself. Ya Asantewa, queen mother of Ejisu, would not abide it. In fiery speeches, she challenged the men of her kingdom to fight, and when some hesitated, she declared she would go to war herself. And she did. She led the last major African war led by a woman, organizing ambushes, managing supplies, and rallying troops despite being outgunned. Eventually captured and exiled, she died far from home. But she remains a national hero in Ghana, her name invoked whenever defiance is needed. She proved that leadership has nothing to do with gender, and everything to do with resolve. Scattered through time are the many unnamed, unhonored warrior women who fought in the shadows of more famous wars. Viking shield maidens, long thought mythical, have emerged through archaeology as very real. Women buried with weapons, armor, and war horses, not as wives, but as warriors. In the deserts of the American Southwest, Apache women like Lozin, spiritual leader, warrior, and strategist, rode beside their brothers, firing bullets with one hand and prayers with the other. These women fought not always to expand, but to protect. Not always to conquer, but to preserve. They were queens and commoners, teachers and rebels, saints and soldiers. And while history may have tried to erase them, modern scholarship, storytelling, and cultural reclamation are beginning to draw their names back into light. They were always there. Silent only because no one listened. Invisible only because no one looked. Their stories are not additions to history. They are corrections. And every time one is told, the world shifts slightly toward truth. Warrior women never needed myths to define them. They simply needed time to be remembered. 12. The enchanted strings and primal breath. Music as sacred force in the ancient world. In a time before memory, when gods walked hand in hand with kings and temples rose like mountains from sun-baked earth, sound was not merely a passing vibration. It was an invocation, a summons to the divine, a language older than words. In the cradle of civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates cradled the fertile plains of ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, music was neither mere pastime nor idle amusement. It pulsed at the heart of ritual, power, and cosmic alignment, an invisible thread binding mortals to the gods they worshipped. Among the oldest and most haunting of musical tools, the Mesopotamian lyre emerged as both instrument and icon, a sacred device whose strings did not merely sing, they spoke. Its origins stretch back over 4,500 years to the Sumerian city-states, such as Ur and Uruk, where music was braided into the lifeblood of palace, court, and temple sanctum alike. These were not simple stringed tools, but elaborate masterpieces carved from fine woods and adorned with gleaming gold, silver, and the deep celestial blue of lapis lazuli. One of the most mesmerizing relics is the bull-headed lyre unearthed by British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, buried within a royal tomb. Its wooden soundbox, shaped like a stylized bull, bore a golden face and a beard of inlaid lapis, not for mere ornament, but symbolic potency, the bull a sign of strength, fertility, and divine protection. This was an instrument that did not merely play, it resonated with mythic force. The lyre was typically strummed by hand or with a plectrum, yielding a tender, vibrating tone that hung in the air like a whisper from the spirit world. Though we can never fully hear the ancient melodies as they once were, scholars have deciphered fragments of Sumerian musical notation etched into clay tablets, evidence that a sophisticated theory of scales and harmonics existed long before Pythagoras. The Sumerians used a heptatonic scale composed of 7 distinct tones that intriguingly mirror the foundations of Western music today. These instruments echoed not only within royal courts, but within the sacred chambers of ziggurats and temples, where music accompanied incense, libations, and sung hymns dedicated to deities like Inanna, goddess of love and war, or Enlil, the great storm god. Music, in this world, was prayer, was offering, was transformation. Sacred vibrations that guided the soul from this world into the arms of eternity. In funerary rites, the lyre was believed to weep alongside the mourners, its voice a bridge for the dead crossing into the realm of the afterlife. Musicians in Mesopotamian society held revered status. Some were priestesses, custodians of temple ritual and divine music. Others were court performers, trained from childhood within specialized academies for scribes and musicians. Each song, each melody, was memorized and passed on like sacred scripture. Today, modern replicas of these lyres are played in museums and academic circles, their ghostly notes resurrected as whispers from the dawn of human expression, reminding us that long before the symphonies of Europe, before Gregorian chants or Homeric odes, we were already chasing beauty through vibration, binding soul to sound in the shimmering heat of Mesopotamia's plains. But where the lyre sang of harmony, divine order, and the measured rhythm of the cosmos, another instrument, the aulos of ancient Greece, spoke in tongues far more primal. The aulos, a double-piped reed instrument, did not whisper to gods. It cried, laughed, screamed. Its twin pipes, often crafted from bone, ivory, or wood, were played simultaneously, each with its own reed and set of finger holes, producing a sound unlike any modern flute, dense, raw, piercing, more akin to a droning bagpipe. The player, or aulit, needed extraordinary breath control, employing a technique known as circular breathing, drawing air in through the nose while pushing it out through puffed cheeks, allowing for uninterrupted streams of sound. This effort warped the player's face so intensely that they became the target of jest among athletes and comedians. Yet the respect for their musical prowess remained. The aulos was not an instrument of idle pleasure, but one of ecstasy, tragedy, and martial power. It belonged to Dionysus, god of wine, frenzy, and transformation, the chaotic counterpoint to Apollo's serene lyre. In theater, the aulos gave breath to the emotions of tragedy and comedy alike. Its voice could mimic the wail of grief, the fury of vengeance, the delirium of joy, often all within the same passage. In war, its sound led hoplites into battle, its reedy cry slicing through the clash of metal and shouts, binding men into unified rhythm. During Bacchic rites, it drove dancers to wild abandon, breaking the self into trance, unleashing the divine animal within. Plato, ever cautious of passion's sway, famously rejected the aulos in his ideal republic, calling it dangerously intoxicating, preferring the cool logic of the lyre and kithara. Yet even he could not deny its force. The aulos, like Dionysus himself, was irresistible. Surviving fragments of the aulos today, mouthpieces, pipe sections, finger holes, lie in museums, some reborn through reconstruction and experimental performance, their urgent tone once again unfurling into air. If the lyre was an offering, the aulos was a possession. If the lyre sang to the gods, the aulos brought the gods into flesh. Together, these ancient instruments illuminate a world where music was not background, not embellishment, but a vital force that shaped reality, spoke to immortality, and stirred the very breath of the cosmos. 13th, the sacred soundscape, ancient instruments and the music of civilizations. before the written word etched its permanence into clay and parchment, before empires rose and fell beneath the sweep of swords and banners, there was sound, unbound, elemental, and eternal. Across mountains, deserts, rivers, and forests, ancient civilizations conjured music not for performance alone, but to speak with gods, to soothe the dying, to stir the spirits of the unborn. It was vibration as vision, melody as ritual, rhythm as memory. Instruments were more than objects. They were vessels of divinity, vessels of identity, crafted not only from wood or metal, but from cosmology, philosophy, and prayer. In this symphony of vanished worlds, each culture plucked its own voice from the breath of creation, and through that, shaped the soul of humanity. In the scholar's studio and the royal hall alike, ancient China listened not just with the ear, but with the heart attuned to the Tao, the cosmic order. Of all the instruments in this vast tradition, none captured the spirit of Chinese introspection and refinement more than the guqin and guzheng, two stringed zithers that shimmered like still water beneath moonlight, yet held within them thunderous depths. The guqin, elder among them, was an instrument not of spectacle, but of subtlety. With its 7 silk strings stretched over a long, fretless body of lacquered wood, the guqin produced a sound so soft, so intimate, that it demanded the stillness of the soul to be heard. It was not designed to entertain, but to elevate, to cultivate virtue and harmony between heaven and earth. Confucius, the great sage of order and ethics, is said to have played the guqin, believing that its tones refined the character and tethered the mind to moral clarity. Sliding tones, plucked harmonics, and gliding vibrato echoed like distant footsteps in snow, its language poetic, its silence sacred. The playing of the guqin was considered a philosophical practice taught to scholars as part of the 4 arts: music, calligraphy, painting, and the game of strategy. In contrast, the guzheng, with its broader body and 16 or more strings, arose as the voice of the outer world, the public, the powerful. Its bridges allowed dramatic glissandos and cascading runs that painted sonic portraits of rivers, galloping horses, or weeping willows in spring rain. Played with plectra affixed to fingers, the guzheng brought music to festivals, to the theater, to the people. If the guqin whispered of stillness, the guzheng sparkled with life. Gendered symbolism followed their use, the guqin a scholar's pursuit, typically male, the guzheng in later dynasties a favorite of courtesans and female performers, yet both were revered as bearers of cultural grace. Today, these instruments are reborn in both classical revival and modern innovation, their voices reminding us that in China, music was never merely sound. It was the path to virtue and a mirror of the universe within. Along the life-giving Nile, where papyrus swayed and stone obelisks pierced the sky, ancient Egypt sculpted music as a bridge between the seen and the unseen. It was not background nor embellishment. It was sacred infrastructure, woven into the structure of existence itself. The harp, evolving from a simple bow to grand angular shapes that towered over performers, served both earthly delight and celestial promise. In temple reliefs and tomb frescoes, harpists play beside the souls of the departed, serenading them into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. Their gentle plucking was a balm for the living and a guide for the dead. No less sacred was the sistrum, a rattling instrument of metal loops and rods used in worship of Hathor, goddess of joy, music, and motherhood. When shaken, its clatter was believed to dispel evil, invoke divine presence, and restore order to chaos. Temples rang with its metallic jangle, and auditory incense offered to the gods. The flute and double clarinet added breath to this world, a dry whisper of desert wind, a drone echoing through stone corridors. The double clarinet, with two pipes played simultaneously, produced a buzzing harmony both strange and entrancing, anticipating later reeded instruments across the Mediterranean. Percussion completed the sacred soundscape: frame drums, clappers, castanets. Music was everywhere, from the chants of temple rituals to the work songs of farmers, from royal feasts to funerals. Many musicians, notably women, served not merely as entertainers but as spiritual practitioners, chantresses of Amun, songstresses of Isis, keepers of divine voice. Instruments were often buried with their owners, with the belief that they would be needed in the afterlife to continue their eternal praise. Though Egypt left few notations, the images and artifacts endure: harps, rattles, flutes, each a relic of sound carved into silence, each an echo of a culture where music was the breath of divinity made audible. Across the savannas and forests of ancient West Africa, sound did not ask to be heard. It commanded. Music was not an art. It was a language, a lineage, a law. Among all instruments, the drum stood supreme, not as a rhythmic accessory, but as a talking presence, a living oracle. The hourglass-shaped talking drum, for instance, was strung with leather cords that could tighten to change pitch, allowing the drummer to mimic the tonality of spoken language. It was a pre-digital communication system. Messages about births, battles, or the movements of kings could be spoken across villages, over hills, through forests. But these were no mere announcements. They were ritual utterances, powered by memory and authority. In the ancient kingdoms of Kush, If, and Benin, drums summoned the ancestors, honored the deities, and sanctified the sacred. Drummers were not entertainers. They were mediators between the physical and spiritual realms, trained from childhood in the secret languages of beat, tone, and time. Their instruments, carved from sacred trees and covered in animal hides, were themselves alive, named, blessed, feared. Drum families included the djembe, dundun, bugarabu, and krin, each with its own ceremonial function and symbolic identity. And percussion didn't end with drums. Bells, rattles, thumb pianos, and shakers layered rhythms in interlocking complexity that prefigured jazz, Afro-Cuban, and funk by millennia. Music was never separate from dance. The body moved as the drum spoke, channeling history, emotion, and spirit into collective ecstasy. Today, though the Atlantic slave trade scattered these rhythms across the globe, they live on, from samba circles in Brazil to second-line parades in New Orleans. But their roots reach deep into African soil, where the drum first found its voice and declared, "I am memory. I am power. I am truth." High in the rarefied air of the Andes, where the clouds brushed terraces carved by ancestral hands, music was not coaxed from strings or pounded from skin, it was breathed into being. For the Nazca, Mochi, and later the Inca, aerophones, flutes, whistles, and most uniquely, the panpipe or siku, were sacred instruments that summoned spirits, honored earth and sky, and stitched human life to cosmic cycles. The siku, constructed from rows of bamboo tubes lashed together, offered not a single melody, but a conversation. Played in interlocking patterns by paired musicians in a technique called hocketing, each contributed alternating notes to a single musical phrase, symbolizing duality, reciprocity, and harmony in nature and society. These were not idle tunes, but structured invocations. Some flutes were carved from bird bones or clay, others adorned with serpent motifs or sacred glyphs, merging art and function in one breath-bound gesture. Among the most mysterious were the whistling water vessels of the moche, ceramic instruments that sang when liquid was poured into them, combining air, water, and resonance into ritual harmony. Music accompanied every life passage: birth, courtship, sowing, harvest, warfare, death, and honored deities like Inti, the sun, and Pachamama, the Earth Mother. The Inca Empire orchestrated vast musical events, with coordinated flutes marking military formations or agricultural ceremonies. Spanish conquest silenced much of this world, yet even today, echoes of those panpipes and flutes sing through Peruvian villages and Bolivian highlands, tethering past to present with each breath of ancestral wind. In ancient India, music was not entertainment, it was ontology. It was the thread from which the cosmos itself was woven. According to Hindu cosmology, the universe was born from vibration, from the sacred syllable Om, a resonance that still hums through every raga, every chant. In the Vedic age, as early as 1500 BCE, priests chanted samans, hymns sung with strict melodic precision to align the soul with divine energies. These chants were not optional. Mispronunciation could, in theory, unravel the ritual and disturb the cosmic order. The Brahmins, keepers of this sonic knowledge, trained in both spiritual philosophy and melodic science. Among instruments, the veena stood as a divine conduit, its long neck, resonating gourd, and sympathetic strings allowed musicians to summon vibrations believed to mirror celestial harmonics. The goddess Saraswati, patron of wisdom and the arts, was often depicted plucking its strings in serene contemplation. Wind instruments like the bansuri, a bamboo flute, were similarly infused with myth. Lord Krishna, the divine lover, enchanted both humans and animals with his flute, a sound that pierced illusion, maya, and opened the gates of higher consciousness. Percussion, too, carried metaphysical weight. The mridangam, tabla, and pakawaj structured time itself through tala, complex rhythmic cycles that echoed the breath and heartbeat of the universe. Indian music followed the doctrine of rasa, each melody or rhythm evoking a specific emotional essence: serenity, heroism, wonder, sorrow, love. Ragas were not just scales, they were atmospheres, intended to be performed at particular times of day or seasons, aligning music with nature's rhythm. Unlike many ancient systems lost to time, India's musical philosophy has endured, living, evolving, yet rooted in the same belief. To make music is to mirror the cosmos, and to sing is to awaken the divine within. 14th, Whispers of the Sacred, the ritual power of ancient music in Mesoamerica and beyond. Long before the clamor of cities and the digital hum of modern life, before the idea of music as mere entertainment had even formed, ancient peoples across the world were already shaping sound into sacred meaning. In the heart of Mesoamerica, amidst the volcanic stone plazas, blood-stained altars, and towering temples of civilizations like the Maya, Aztec, and Teotihuacano, music was not composed for pleasure, but for power. It did not exist to soothe the ear, but to awaken spirits, consecrate rituals, command the skies, and terrify enemies into silence. The people of this land didn't simply listen to music. They offered it like incense. They wore it like skin. They wove it into every breath of ceremonial life. From the moment of birth to the passage into death, music carried the soul along its destined path, acting as a bridge between realms, the physical and the divine, the living and the ancestral, the seen and the unseen. One could feel it in the pulse of the huehuetl, a tall, cylindrical drum hewn from sacred tree trunks and crowned with taut animal skins, its surface inscribed with glyphs and gods. When played with bare hands, its deep resonance rippled across stone courtyards and temple stairways, like the heartbeat of the cosmos itself. The huehuetl did not merely keep rhythm, it invoked time itself. Beside it, the teponastli, a slit drum with tongues carved into its hollow wooden body, sang with a different spirit. Struck with rubber-tipped mallets, it could produce two pitches, and among the Nahua-speaking peoples, it was said that this drum could speak in the tongue of fate, voicing the names of gods, or echoing the rhythm of rainfall and prophecy. But the air was not only pierced by drums. Wind instruments made from bone, clay, or reed were shaped like jaguars, serpents, or skeletal death gods. Some flutes imitated bird song or howler monkeys, while others, like the infamous Aztec death whistle, shrieked with a scream so primal that it could paralyze the living. This small, skull-shaped whistle, when blown, unleashed a piercing, blood-curdling sound, likely designed to unnerve enemies or signal the arrival of sacrifice. Conch shells were blown to call the gods. Bone flutes wailed during funerals, and reed pipes danced through agricultural rites. Music here was not passive. It was an activator. During festivals, dancers in feathered headdresses and jade beads moved in synchrony with pounding drums and shrieking flutes, transforming plazas into sacred theaters of transformation. In sacrificial rituals, music did not accompany the offering. It prepared it, sanctified it, and carried its power skyward. Drums thundered as hearts were lifted to the sun, flutes cried as blood flowed down temple steps, and conch shells sang to the heavens, asking that the cycle of life and death continue in balance. Musicians were trained not in music theory, but in spiritual precision. They attended special schools where they learned the sacred codes of performance, how to summon rain, how to honor the maize gods, how to guide souls to the underworld. Some instruments were so sacred they were only allowed to be played by nobles or priests, and to strike the wrong rhythm could be considered an insult to the gods. In Mesoamerica, music did not entertain, it transformed. It turned ordinary space into ritual space, and ordinary moments into portals. Even today, though the empires have fallen, and their languages may fade, the essence of their music has not vanished. It lingers in the patterns of indigenous dances, in the rhythm of traditional drumming, in the breath of handmade flutes still played high in the hills of southern Mexico and Guatemala. Yet this deep truth was not confined to Mesoamerica. Across the world, from the strings of the Chinese guqin to the pulse of African talking drums to the breath of Andean panpipes, music was designed not to be consumed, but to be embodied. In India, the pluck of a vena was not a performance, it was a spiritual act, believed to vibrate in harmony with the cosmos. In Africa, drums didn't just entertain, they spoke, announcing births, deaths, summoning spirits, and encoding tribal laws before writing existed. In the Andes, paired musicians performed interlocking melodies on sikus, mirroring the Andean philosophy of duality and unity. Each of these ancient cultures understood what we, in the modern world, are only beginning to remember. That music is not just sound, it is memory, identity, and intention. Even in the structure of modern Western music, we hear the echoes of ancient modes, the 7-note heptatonic scale from Mesopotamia, Greek intervals and modes that laid the groundwork for classical harmony, the lyre that became the lute, then the guitar, and the double reed olos that inspired the oboe. But more than scales or instruments, what survives is the original purpose. Music was not a product, it was process. It marked time, held stories, healed wounds, and elevated the soul. And it still can. In an age overwhelmed with algorithmic playlists and commodified noise, the ancient world reminds us that music can still be sacred, that a single drum beat can still summon our ancestors, a single flute note can still dissolve the walls between worlds, and that in every sound there can be something deeper, a memory, a ritual, a prayer. We